Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the return of the Mailbox for the 26th of November 2016. My name is Totalbiscuit, answering a few questions from the viewer base. We've got quite a few stockpiled up, but in the next couple of weeks we'll be making available a place to leave your own questions. And the game in the background is Ashes of the Singularity Escalation that I should be playing around with hopefully for a forthcoming video. Let's kick it right off with the first question, and it goes something along the lines of this. Why do you think it's acceptable for companies to flat out lie to consumers in the gaming industry, whereas in other industries you'd face a bunch of lawsuits? Do you think a breakthrough case is on the horizon? Do you believe that someone will take one of these studios to court and win big time? Well, it's not as if there haven't been attempts to do so, and some of them have been relatively successful. A couple of recent examples of that would be the class action lawsuit against Nvidia for misrepresenting the amount of effective video RAM that the 970 graphics card has. It was advertised as 4GB, but while that's technically true, it's actually got 3.5 gigs of regular VRAM and then 0.5 gigs of the VRAM doesn't end up functioning in the same way, which can actually cause some slowdown and problems in certain titles with high VRAM usage. They were successfully sued via a class action lawsuit, and everybody that bought a 970 received a settlement payment of $30, assuming that they actually claimed it. That, if anything, may very well point out why a lot of people don't really bother. A class action lawsuit is one of the most effective ways of dealing with a company that presents a product that doesn't work properly or was misrepresented in their advertising literature. However, class action lawsuits tend to make a lot of money for lawyers and not a lot of money for anybody else. The fact that everybody got $30 is kind of a big demonstration of that. Practically, Nvidia lost millions over that class action lawsuit. But in terms of aiding the consumer, it didn't really do all that much. It was more punitive than restorative. It's also worth noting that while some people may say that Nvidia lost the case, they technically didn't. They settled a preliminary settlement rather than going through a lengthy court battle, which could have very well cost them an awful lot more. And as a result, you end up with this whole $30 per person class action settlement, which was uncapped. There could have been an unlimited number of claimants, but we don't exactly know how many came along, whereas I know the attorney fees for that case, even with the settlement, were about $1.3 million. Could have been an awful lot more than that, but quicker and easier to settle, more often than not. Now, will this encourage Nvidia not to pull the same kind of thing in the future? Hopefully. That's kind of the point. But the problem is that class action lawsuits in gaming historically have not been all that successful. A recent example of that would be the class action lawsuit against Sony in regards to Killzone Shadowfall. And that was for misrepresenting the resolution that the game actually ran at. Sony claimed the game ran at 1080p. In reality, in the multiplayer, they used technology that created a false 1080p image. It's called temporal reprojection. We've seen that technology applied both in console and PC games as of late in various forms. The notion that, yeah, you're rendering at 1080p, but there are some aspects of the scene that are not, and that's how we're getting our performance. That case was thrown out of court. Now, whether or not you agree with that is a matter of opinion. I lean on the side of the consumer. I say that claiming you're running at 1080p where in reality you're basically faking it is false advertising, is misrepresentation. Whether or not a lawsuit of $5 million plus in damages was reasonable for that is an entirely different matter, but it is something that should be addressed. These sort of things should be held to account. You've got a number of problems with that, though. And firstly, when it comes to technological cases, there are quite a few issues with the judges in general, who are simply not tech-savvy enough to make a proper judgment, which is why we get all sorts of ridiculous statements and weird judgments from time to time. And as I mentioned before, the class action lawsuit is generally a fairly inefficient way of helping the consumer out. In reality, a much better way of dealing with consumer protection is through consumer protection legislation, such as the Sale of Goods Act in the UK, which does provide rights to refund in various circumstances, and there are plenty of countries that have a lot of laws regarding false advertising. Now, I would imagine that that legislation is used quite frequently, but it's used on an individual level, and that's not the kind of thing that really makes the news. I imagine there are quite a few people that use their country's respective legislation to get refunds on products. but it's not done en masse, which is why it's only really class action lawsuits and mass consumer revolts that really get the coverage. Small claims court is also a reasonable way of getting your money back if you run into any problems with the use of that sort of thing, but you gotta bear this in mind. There's a big difference between, say, a faulty game and a faulty car. This is an entertainment media industry with relatively disposable products that, compared to many other things, are relatively inexpensive. They are certainly not as expensive as motor vehicles, consumer appliances, smartphones, all that sort of thing. So when a Note 7 explodes, an $800 phone, that's kind of a big deal. When a $60 game doesn't work properly on launch, it really is not as important. And I say that as someone who is a consumer advocate in this industry. That is my job, so I'm supposed to believe that it's important, and it is. But in the grand scheme of things, video games generally don't ruin lives. They generally don't kill people. They generally don't cause you mass problems or injury or something along those lines. The worst, for the most part, that can happen is that they simply don't work properly. And that's annoying. It's an inconvenience. Sure, you should get a refund, but it's by no means life-threatening. So I think that's really got an awful lot to do with it. You can argue the fallacy of relative privation, just saying, that, oh, well, you can't argue that these problems are irrelevant just because they're not as big a deal as other problems. You're totally right on that one. But regardless of that, it's hard to build real passion for a consumer protection case for something that isn't vital, that doesn't have any lasting real-world implications. I'd also say, just to aim a couple of warning shots at certain elements of the consumer base, that there appear to be a group of gamers with very short memories. While there is a vocal consumer base, certainly online, that will complain about problems and do so loudly, and that's a good thing, there are plenty more people that are either not part of that group and are simply pre-ordering and buying video games and not contributing to that particular discussion, or are actually full-on hypocrites and are making those complaints and yet going out and pre-ordering the next big hype thing anyway. Consumer hype culture is massive in the video game industry, more so than the movie industry, in my opinion, at this point, regardless of repeatedly running into situations where it's been proven that this hype is false, that this hype is misrepresentative, that this hype is absolutely unjustified, and will lead to disappointment. Will the general consumer base ever learn, as it were? I don't think the whole one will, by any stretch of the imagination. It's just too large a group of people. It's too disparate. They're not connected really by anything. If you believe the internet, you'd have to wonder how it's possible that anybody still pre-orders anymore, considering how vocally opposed people seem to be to it. Well, the reality is that the people who are pre-ordering are either defending themselves with the good old, oh, it's my money, I can do what I want, my freedoms, but a lot of people are simply not part of that conversation at all. They're not part of that community. It's very easy to be misled to believe that these vocal online communities are the majority when that's the culture that you're immersed in. In reality, you're not seeing the wood for the trees there. There are a hell of a lot more gamers, and they are much more difficult to reach with that sort of relatively activist behavior. So conclusion is, it's not acceptable. It has never been acceptable, but the consequences for doing so are less severe in this industry than they would be in others. And that is down to its nature as a fairly disposable entertainment medium, as opposed to anything that has a massive real-world impact and can actually be life-threatening. Here's the next question. Do you think the relationship between video game developers and journalists and critics has become less sketchy since the Shadow of Mordor, XB1M13, and Gamergate incidents, or is there still a lot that needs to change to protect consumers? I don't think the relationship has become less sketchy. I think that over the past few years, general consumption trends for media have changed, and as a direct result, the various pitfalls and potentially manipulative agreements that could be put in place have in themselves also been altered. It's interesting that you bring up the Shadow of Mordor and XB1M13 things, because those are both related to YouTube and Twitch, not related to traditional written games media. And that, if anything, is indicative, again, of the shift in media consumption from quite a lot of people within the gaming scene. Not everybody. Sites like IGN are still very large, and of course a lot of these written websites and more traditional websites are still around. But there are an awful lot of people that get their games information now from YouTube and from live streamers. And there's actually a real potential there for far more serious abuse Most of the more substantive abuse that came from traditional games media outlets, as opposed to the more far-fetched conspiratorial stuff, was related less to receiving brown paper bags under the table full of cash, and more to do with the quid pro quo insidious relationship between publishers and their advertising dollars and these websites that were reliant on coverage, more often than not as early as possible. Now, a lot of these relationships do still exist. Most, if not all, traditional games media websites still receive the lion's share of their income from advertising on the site, and of course, what would you advertise on your site as opposed to video games? I mean, it's an ideal targeted advertisement. Arguments are repeatedly made that the marketing department and the editorial department are two completely separate things, but one, we don't know how true that actually is. We simply have to go by the word of those organizations. And secondly, that doesn't necessarily matter. Again, we aren't talking about brown paper bag under the table stuff. We're talking about a more long-term situation in which publishers exact more subtle influence over games media providers. The biggest straw man that is often bandied around in this situation is that these relationships are mustache-twirling supervillain style stuff. No. It is more subtle, it is more long-term, and it's insidious as opposed to overt. One of the most obvious examples of that is stuff like IGN First. What you've got is a big quid pro quo relationship between IGN and these publishers. They get earlier access, they get exclusive footage in return for a ton of space on the site. Now, this coverage is universally positive or, at the worst case, neutral. And regardless of whether or not the game ends up being a stinker and is reviewed poorly, which in the vast majority of circumstances, if you look at the games that have been covered under programs like IGN First, does not happen, the vast majority of them do get good reviews, there is still a ton of positive coverage on the website, and that influences people. You can say, well, there's obviously no bias here because the ending review gave it a 5 or whatever. That doesn't necessarily counteract the 20 positive articles that existed on the site before that, and each of those positive articles influenced consumers in such a way as to build hype. Now, when I talk about access, I'm also discussing the notion that it is against the best interests of sites to provide negative criticism and reviews of products, because it is far less likely that the PR companies doling out this coverage will give access later on, and quiet industry blacklisting happens all the time. We have heard of instances such as Jim Sterling, who is apparently considered a wild card by EA, and as a result does not receive pre-release review copies of their major AAA titles. I have not received a pre-release review copy of a major AAA title for EA since Dragon Age Inquisition, I might add, despite our repeated requests for it. Whether or not I am also pseudo-blacklisted by EA remains to be seen. I really have no idea. It doesn't affect us all that much, and that's a very good thing, but these sites that rely more on being first and being on time with their reviews because they have less loyalty from their viewer base and they rely more on, say, traffic from Metacritic than YouTubers do, who have people that will wait for reviews, does result in these sites erring on the side of caution when dealing with these PR companies who can, on a whim, deny access. And really, there's not a lot you can do about that, and it's very hard to prove that the PR company did anything to you to begin with. Now, I mentioned earlier that the situation's a little bit different and potentially even worse, and I bring that up simply because you mentioned Shadow of Mordor and XP1 and 13. These are both big examples of blatant undisclosed influence within the YouTube space. There's been a lot of attention, and rightly so, put on the fact that in recent years, there's a lot of native advertising that's cropped up on YouTube, and it is not properly disclosed. There have been several recent examples this year. The T. Martin and Pro Syndicate incident, in which they owned a company which provided online gaming for Counter-Strike Go, and yet misrepresented it, claiming that they did not, and then advertised their service to their young audience, is a prime example of massive abuse of both trust and the law. I can tell you for a fact that there have been streamers and YouTubers who have played a game, they have done so as part of a brand deal in which they are paid to play the game, and they have not disclosed that fact. Does that necessarily lead to an overly biased impression of it? Not necessarily, but it always leads to bias, even if it is unconscious. It may not even be a positive bias. It can be a negative bias as well, simply because you're trying to overcompensate for the fact that you know in your mind, hey, I got paid for this, so I'm going to be extra critical just to counterbalance that. Well, no, that means that your opinion has been manipulated and there is a bias there, so your opinion cannot be trusted quite as much. I think at this point that the bigger issue is, in fact, influence on YouTubers and streamers. Direct, targeted, native advertising. Games companies have come around to the idea that it is a very effective way of selling video games, and it is a relatively cheap and reliable way of advertising to a large audience. These deals can be just fine as long as they are properly disclosed and they are not misrepresented as an unbiased opinion. On the plus side, since there have been quite a few incidents of this as of late, the overall awareness level for quite a few people has got an awful lot higher. This means that quite a few viewers are on guard against this sort of thing and are naturally suspicious, to the point where plenty of people are falsely accused of providing sponsored coverage, which is annoying, but not necessarily a massive problem. Like, if that's the cost of increased consumer awareness and vigilance against this kind of behavior, that you have to deal with the occasional false accusation, then so be it. It sucks, but that's something of the cost of doing business, and I think in terms of its net effect, it ends up being a positive in the long run. The other thing that we do have to worry about is less this native advertising and more the idea that some games companies are starting to come around to the notion that they don't actually have to provide review copies to anybody prior to release, and the game will sell well regardless. Bethesda being a prime example of that, and we immediately saw what can happen as a result of that policy with the release of Dishonored 2, which had a bunch of problems, and we would have known about that prior to release if review copies had been issued. So some people pre-ordered a game that didn't work properly. They may very well have not done so if that information was out there. Of course, that's something we as consumers could avoid by not pre-ordering video games, but the more companies that decide to go down this road, the worse it will get unless there is a big consumer shift in behavior. We've always been in this situation where in reality the big threat is not the media, the threat is actually the publisher, and yet I think it's become way more obvious in 2016, whereas companies have been less blatant about it in previous years, and things were uncovered, things were discovered, things that were hidden, as opposed to in 2016 where companies like Bethesda brazenly come out and say, yeah, screw you, we ain't giving you review copies, deal with it. Publishers and developers have become emboldened by reckless consumer behavior, and that, if anything, is the biggest threat that we're currently facing. Alright folks, that is me done for the day. Thank you very much for watching the Mailbox. If you like the video, by all means do feel free to click the like button. If not, the dislike button is right over there, and I'll see you next time.